We are at a point in time where people acknowledge that climate change is a thing and that we need to do something. People acknowledge that there are a lot of problems with the ocean and we need to do something to protect it. We have that acknowledgement and people are talking about it, which is fantastic. But the actions don't necessarily follow with what people are saying, and that could be dangerous because we're running out of time. We're really running out of time. And we're going to talk about what needs to change in order for us to actually see action that will do something to protect the ocean and reduce climate change. We're going to talk about that on this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. You ready to start the show? Let's do this. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin, and this is the podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. And we're going to talk about taking action today. We're going to talk about the fact that we don't take enough action. We hear a lot, I mean a lot of talk around what we need to do and promises that people are saying that we're going to do that actually, mean, like, if they get it done, it's like, oh, okay, we can get some stuff done. This is great. But if it doesn't happen, then they're just not going to, nothing's going to happen. We're just not going to get stuff done. And unfortunately, that's what's happening today. Or you'll see action that actually takes place, but then the counteraction that we're supposed to be reducing continues to take place. And that's a problem. That's a problem that I don't want to see. And it's a problem that we're going to talk about today because I think it's one of the primary things that we have to do as a planet, as a collective, to say, you know what? We need to do better in how we attack climate change, in how we approach protecting the ocean. We need to act more and we need to act fast. That's what it comes down to. And we are just not seeing it at all. And it frustrates the heck out of me. It really does frustrate the heck out of me. And so that's why I want to talk about it. And to be honest, I was listening, the idea for this show came from a podcast that I was listening to. And the podcast is called A Climate Change with Matt Mattern. I don't know much about Matt Mattern. I really like his show because I like a lot of the things that have been that he's been discussing on the show, talks to a lot of people within climate change world that work to stop climate change or reduce climate change or whatever that may be. And I'm happy to see that. I'm happy to see that people are talking about this. And the podcast that I'm thinking of, the episode that I'm thinking of, was the most recent episode, and it's with a candidate for president. This is Marianne Williamson on a so the episode is Marianne Williamson on a fossil-free future, creating a Department of Peace and more. So there's a bunch of stuff that they talk about. They get into the politics of it all, and I'm not a huge, political fan of, listening to podcasts that talk politics all the time and only politics. I was very interested because it's a climate change podcast. That's what it is. And so I was very interested in listening, especially the beginning, because Marianne Williamson criticizes the Democratic, presidential candidate, Joe Biden, who's current president, of course. And he's going to be running in 2024. And she says that he's a liar. She calls for a mass mobilization, transformative leadership, and a global action, suggesting tariffs to encourage sustainable practices. So there's a bunch of, the discussion goes on in a bunch of different ways. And if if you want to know more about the candidates that are running, I believe for the Democratic presidential nomination, this would be a good podcast to listen to, especially if you're interested in a sort of climate change and politics. It's a really, really good one. Now, I want to preface by saying I don't have an affinity necessarily towards Democratic or Republican candidates. I mean, you've heard me before talk about it. I'm very much for human rights, and sometimes the Republicans and the conservatives here in Canada kind of walk a very thin line around that, and so I'm not a huge fan of them when they do that. But I don't really care in terms of as long as the I don't care about other things they talk about, like small government to big government. Those are the biggest changes between Democrats and Republicans. When it comes to pro-choice and it comes to guns and everything like that, I disagree with Republicans in a lot of ways. Regardless, we're not here to talk about my political affinity, but we are talking about politics. And this one was actually a Democrat criticizing a Democrat. And with that said, President Joe Biden has done more for the climate than any other president that has been around. And he kind of dubs himself, apparently, the climate change president or the climate president. And that's interesting to see, because if you look at it, from my scientific senses go off as soon as I hear that, because he probably has done more for the climate than any other president. That's because any other president, including prime ministers, haven't really done much for the climate in the past. That's why we're in the situation that we're in, is because governments did not take enough action and did not take it seriously to take enough action to do something about climate change. Now we're getting mass protests, and this is like a big change just for people to acknowledge that climate change has actually happened. And we, and that's great. We're starting to see that. We're starting to see millions of people around the world protest. We've seen it, whether it be Greta Thunberg or any of the other young advocates who have done such a great job in mobilizing people to take action and tell governments that they need to take care of this planet. They need to take care of the climate. They need to take care of the ocean. They need to take care of the planet, like of the earth. They need to take care of everything. And that's just something that, it just needs to happen. And so it's nice to see that the governments are starting to acknowledge that, and they're starting to talk about that, and they're starting to propose policies, usually one side over the other. And for some reason in North America, I don't know anything about Mexican politics because I don't follow it. It's not on TV and it's not accessible. And a lot of times in Spanish, I can't speak Spanish. So it has nothing to do with the politics there. I just don't know much about it. I follow American politics. I follow Canadian politics, of course, because I live in Canada. And essentially what happens is when you have the conservatives and the Republicans, which are very similar in style, they don't have climate change plans. They're very, very small, if there's anything, and it usually has to do with carbon capture, so that we can continue to, pollute the atmosphere, and just saying, well, we'll capture just as much as we're putting in, which doesn't work right now. We do not have the technology to do that. There have been studies that show that we do not have the technology to do that. And there was a paper that came out, or an article that came out recently in Canada before Christmas, that basically said the same thing. We're not going to be able to meet our targets because we rely too heavily on the carbon capture system. It's just not where it needs to be at this point in time. But regardless, one side tends to be more focused towards climate change, or more focused towards the ocean and the planet, protecting the planet and the environment, rather than the other. So it usually tends to be liberals or Democrats, and then the conservatives and the Republicans tend to be a little bit less against the environment. They're more for big business. They're more for private businesses and so forth. And usually those tend to butt up against the environment and in conflict with the environment quite a bit. So that's what tends to happen, right? We tend to see these types of things happen when we're looking at talking about climate and talking about the environment. Now, going back to President Biden, it says he's the climate president. And on this podcast, Marianne Williamson says that he's not the climate president. He has approved just the same, like he's approved oil and gas projects just as much as he's address climate change in a bill. I believe it's called the Inflation Act, or the Anti-Inflation Act. I'm not too sure what it's called, but he's essentially proposed a number of climate change solutions and pieces of legislation within that act. And then on the other hand, he's approved an $8 billion Willow project and a couple of other ones, or at least one more in the North Slope, like in Alaska. And so we're seeing sort of this, well, yeah, we're doing something about climate change, but we're just going to continue business as usual, what it seems, with oil and gas projects being open. And he's not the only person who's done that. He's not the only government who's done that. The Canadian government has done the exact same thing. The Liberals came in, we're saying, we're about the environment, we're for the environment, we're going to do something about climate change, we need to address climate change. Comes out with all these policies to reduce climate change. It's starting to work, but then approves the expansion of a oil and gas pipeline, at the same time. Right? Or in and around the same time. Definitely within the same term. They're in direct conflict of each other. And if you ask them, they'll say, well, look, we are a especially Canada, we are a natural resource country. Our economy depends on natural resources, including oil and natural gas. In fact, it's a huge thing. When oil prices go down, so does our economy here in Canada. It's very much tied to the oil and gas. So it makes this moving away, this movement of going away from oil and gas, really difficult, really complex, because there are a lot of people who work within the industry. There's a lot of money that comes to the government of Canada, and there's a lot of money that is paid to the employees of the people who work, whether they be as contractors or whether they be as full-time employees or what have you. Now, a lot of the money, a lot of the companies who come in and make a lot of the money off of oil and gas are not Canadian companies, and they take the money outside of Canada. So there's that aspect as well. But what I'm trying to say is it's very complex because a lot of people depend on the money that comes in from oil and gas, including the government, like the subsidies that come in. So, a lot of people will come in and they'll say, we have to cancel the subsidies. We have to, move away from oil and gas. We have to move more towards the green energy. And even though at the time when, pre-2020, our infrastructure within North America for renewable energy was next to nothing. You'd have a number of projects going up, but not enough to significantly contribute to the energy in Canada or in the United States. And there was still a lot of discussions around pipelines. There's a pipeline that went through North Dakota, and I forget, a Keystone pipeline. And then there's the pipeline that goes to the west coast of Canada from the tar sands and so forth. And those are oil and gas pipelines that can cause a lot of damage environmentally if there's a leak and when there's a leak, because there's usually a leak. And then, of course, it's continuing to depend on oil and gas. So, but at that time, the technology wasn't there. The technology's gotten better. We've been able to create it for cheaper and use more of it and make more. We've been able to find places, and the renewable energy is contributing to the planet, like to those countries, Canada and the US, but it's still not at the point where we want it to be, and at the point where we can completely divest ourselves from oil. So whether new projects have to be approved or not is one question, right? Obviously, anytime you approve a project, that project has a lifetime to it. It's going to end at some point. So it's good for the government to continue to, if they're going to depend on oil and gas, it's good for the government to approve other, locations to drill so that we can have that continuation of these types of natural resources, oil and gas. But if we're trying to move away from oil and gas, and we're trying to move away from the climate, then it's time to do so. And Marianne Williamson, who's a candidate, Democratic presidential candidate, she is saying that Biden is not moving fast enough and not moving aggressive enough, not to the point that we need to really reduce climate change, to the point where it'll be under the 1.5 degrees Celsius increase that scientists are worried about. If it goes over that amount, 1.5 degrees Celsius, then we're in trouble. There's going to be a lot more trouble in wildfires, in floods, right? Storm surges, droughts. There's going to be a lot more of that. That could be, we're headed more towards dangerous times. And the predictions are all above 1.5 degrees Celsius as we are today, if we continue what we're doing today. So we know that it requires a change, but do we know how much of a change that requires? Do we know that this change is really going to require a fundamental change in the mindset that we have, not only as individuals, not only as communities, not only as regions, not only as countries, but as a global community? We need to change this. And a great analogy and a great example that they used in the podcast, and I've heard it used elsewhere, is Stanley Cups. Now, I get confused every time somebody says Stanley Cups to me, especially recently, because I'm Canadian. The Stanley Cup is the award, the trophy that an NHL team gets when they win their finals, when they win the Stanley Cup finals, right? They get the Stanley Cup, they get to show it off. It's a huge thing of pride. There's actually, fun fact, there's actually one person who's in charge of the Stanley Cup to carry it around everywhere, and he wears gloves when he touches it. Very, very interesting fact. Anyway, Stanley Cups are what Yetis are. I have a Yeti. They're very similar. Stanley Cups are basically reusable bottles. They're massive. Some of them are really massive. You've seen jokes on TikTok where, typically women have these Stanley Cups. I haven't seen a lot of men with them, but typically women carry them around. And in videos on TikTok, you see their husbands or their partners making fun of them by holding like a garbage pail with a broom in it and being like, oh, my wife walking around with Stanley Cups. So it's just like a fun kind of thing. But from a standpoint of the environment, a reusable mug or reusable cup is something that is good for the environment. as long as you don't buy too many. And apparently there's been recent articles come out that people have been trampling over others at a Target, or at multiple Targets, I guess, trying to get access to specialized, I guess their limited edition Stanley Cups for Valentine's. And there's a video of people just like really moving fast to get to an area where there's like a display where these Stanley Cups are, and they're running over each other to get it. Now, as a mug, a reusable mug on itself, it can carry, hot tea or coffee or hot drinks of any sort if you like hot water. And then it has like you can have cool drinks, everything, and it'll keep it hot, it'll keep it cold depending on what you want, right? Great. The idea though of a reusable cup or a reusable mug is to reuse it. So you don't have too many. But people are buying them in droves so they can have that much. The whole point of this is there's a level of consumerism that is happening within on the planet where we have to have the stuff. One thing that, unfortunately, my dad passed away back in October, and I always try and remember things from him, right? Like, I miss him dearly, obviously. He was like one of my best friends in the world, and we had a great time together. One of the things when I was a kid, I'll never forget this. I used to have a lot of toys when I was a kid, right? And my dad we were at a mall in Quebec City, where he was originally from. Both my parents are originally from. We visited, we have lots of family there. We're in a mall, and he comes and he's so proud of this shirt. He's like, Andrew, I got you the best shirt. You're going to love this shirt. And it's a shirt that says, and it was my first kind of shirt that had like a saying on it. And it says, he who dies with the most toys wins. He who dies with the most toys wins. And that kind of sums up our life, as people, as human beings these days. It's who has the most stuff. If you look at, I'm a big fan of rap music. If you look at rap music, look at what they're bragging about, the rappers, how much stuff they have, how expensive their stuff is, right? Even the people with these Stanley Cups, how many do you have? Oh, I have like 10. I have 100. I have 1,000. There are people who actually have 1,000 Stanley Cups. It's ridiculous. You don't need that many, but people go overboard because they're just like, I have the most stuff. Because it's like, if I die with the most stuff, I win. What do you win? I don't know. I have no idea what you win. You don't win anything, right? But it's not necessary. And here's the thing. Your mindset to save the ocean, to protect the planet from climate change, and just protect the environment in general, we need to switch our mindset from one of consumerism is the best to let's just think about the planet when we buy stuff. Do you need more than one reusable cup or mug? No. I'm kind of guilty of this. I am very fortunate. I coach. I get to coach. I mentor people. I like from a coaching perspective in sports and football, American football and in hockey. I love it. I really do enjoy it. I do girls hockey, I coach girls hockey, and I coach boys football, and I love it. And I get gifts at the end of the year, which is very nice of the people. Some come in the form of cards, some come in the form of gifts, and it's usually a reusable mug. I have probably about 6 or 7 Yetis now just from getting them all the time. I try and give them away and have my kids use them and so forth, and so it's good in that respect, but I have too many. So I'm guilty of this as well, just as getting them as gifts. But it's and you get them in swag all the time from companies and so forth. But the whole point is like we need to switch from that mindset of consumerism and he or she or they who die with the most toys wins. Right? You don't have to have all of that stuff. You should, like, that stuff is not going to make you happy. It might make you feel better because you have more than other people or you got it before someone else, but that's short term. The long term, when you speak to people who are on their deathbed or are close to dying, when you speak to them, you realize that, hey, it's the experiences in my life that counted, not as much stuff as I had. Just because you have a ton of money doesn't make you happy. Right? It's the experience and how you experience life, not only from like a hiking and environmental perspective, going to all the oceans or things like that, but being around people that you love, family, having a big family. Some people like that. Some people like having dogs and taking care of the dogs, like rescue dogs or cats or animals of some sort, right? It's how you lived your life. Some people think it's how you were respected throughout your life, but it's how you lived your life that counts. And we desperately need to switch mindset from that of I need to buy as many things as possible because I don't want to be left out to I need to have an adventure or I need to enjoy life. Right? You don't need a ton of money to be happy. You just need to have what makes you feel happy. And money's not always it. Sure, it's nice to pay your bills and not have to worry about money. But at some point, it's not, you're going to look back and you're like, this is not making me happy, unhappy, or happy. The people around me, the things that I do with my life is what makes me happy. And sometimes money can put you in that position. I get it. But to do something about climate change, you have to work in the direct opposite way of what we were doing. And we have to be more aggressive about it. We can't just sit back and talk about it and maybe do, here's some little things you can do something. But then right away you turn around and you do the opposite. So in other words, if you say, oh, we're going to increase our solar output to, 20 to 30%. And then on the opposite, we are actually going to improve more oil and gas that will increase our fossil fuel usage 20 to 30%. You can't do both and expect the environment to be better. We are in a dire situation where we have to be more aggressive in what we do with the environment and how to protect it and putting forth legislation and solutions to protect it and being aggressive. That means being a little radical. And I feel like that's where we need to go. That's where we all need to go. Me, you, everybody. We need to get to a point where we move faster, even though it's going to cause some discomfort at times. When people put in marine protected areas, the local communities get together and fishermen are very worried about what's going to happen to their fishing areas. A lot of the times where they place marine protected areas are in areas where people fish because that's where all the fish are. And that's great because it'll protect the fish for the long term. But in the meantime, what do people do? What do they do with all of that stuff? What do they do without fishing? Right? How do they make money? It puts them in a couple of years of discomfort, right? Not catching as many fish and so forth until we see results of the marine protected area where there's more fish, there are bigger fish, and they spill over out from the marine protected area into the surrounding areas where the fishermen can finally catch the fish that they were catching 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. That's where we need to go. We need to get to that point, right? We need to sacrifice a little bit in comfort to get back to where we need to be from a climate perspective and from an ocean protection perspective. And I was a proponent for a long time of just being like, hey, you know what? Like, this is reality here. We're never going to get to a point where we actually sacrifice that. I feel like we're at that point right now, especially after this summer. We have to really, truly consider it. We have to really, truly consider accelerating our plans instead of slowing them down. Because you always hear, even in Canada here, we're supposed to go net zero by 2050 and get close, 30 by 30 by 2030, like protect 30% of the ocean and 30% of the earth in each country by 2030. We're going to see, as we get closer, we're going to see people delaying. We're not going to meet those. We're not going to meet the 2030 deadline. We're not going to meet the 2030 deadline. And people are going to think that's a failure. They're going to start all over, but they're not going to continue to protect that 30%. Right? We need to just keep building, but we need to work faster instead of delaying. And we need to do the same thing about climate change. Canada's doing a carbon tax. Some people do cap and trade. Sometimes they do both. There's different things that we can do, and we just have to be more aggressive. It may not be fun. We may not like it. I don't like paying more taxes, but I pay a carbon tax, right? Because we need to get this done. We need to get this under control before it's really too late, because we're already starting to hit that mark. We've probably already passed that mark, right? But there's still time to recoup what we had before. And we can't do that at the pace that we're moving. And it's going to create, it's causing the solution to be that we need to be more aggressive in moving things over. We have to admit that we were wrong in how fast we did it and how slow we did it and move faster so that we can get to a point where we can be happy with what we did with the planet and then move from there, then maybe slow it down a little bit, right? But we need to continue this pace right now. We need to be aggressive in how we approach climate, how we approach ocean protection. Now, if you want to go to that podcast, after you listen to this podcast, you can go. It's called A Climate Change with Matt Mattern. Matt Mattern seems to be, he was in politics at one point. I didn't realize this. He's from the U.S. It's a great episode. I highly recommend it. It's not very long. I think it's like 45 minutes or so. But it's a great listen, maybe on your commute to and from work or to and from school. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that podcast, even just the episodes in general. Are you a fan of it? Do you know? I don't know much about Matt Mattern. Do you know much about him? I'd love to hear your thoughts. He kind of defends President Biden in this case because President Biden is doing something, and not many people did something, including Obama. So we'll see. We'll see what you think. Let me know. Hit me up on Instagram at How to Protect the Ocean. I'd love to hear what you think. And thank you so much for listening. That's it for today's episode. I really want to thank you so much for listening to this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I am your host, Andrew Lewin. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.